In March of 2000, the Golden Raspberry Awards nominated a 10-year-old boy for Worst Supporting Actor. Let that land for a second. A child. A sixth grader. A kid named Jake Lloyd, who'd been cast at age 8, who showed up to work every day on a soundstage at Leavesden Studios in England, hit his marks, said his lines, and did exactly what the adults in the room told him to do. That kid got publicly declared one of the worst actors of the year by an institution that sent press releases to every major entertainment outlet on the planet. He was 10. He didn't write the script. He didn't direct himself. He didn't greenlight the movie. He played pretend in front of a camera, which is literally what child actors do, and the culture punished him for it. And that was just the beginning of the hate train for the prequels. Because what happened to Jake Lloyd wasn't an isolated incident of bad luck or a one-off lapse in judgment. It was the opening salvo of a systematic, years-long campaign of collective cruelty aimed at the actors of the Star Wars prequel trilogy. A campaign waged by fans, critics, internet forums, and Hollywood institutions alike. And if you grew up loving those movies, if you quoted "Hello there" before it was cool, if you felt a strange shame for enjoying them because the entire culture told you they were garbage, this story is yours. You were right. You were always right. But let's build the case properly. Start with the evidence. Jake Lloyd was born on March 5th, 1989. George Lucas reportedly saw thousands of kids before casting him. Lloyd had already appeared alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1996's Jingle All the Way, so the kid had camera experience. He was 8 years old when he started shooting The Phantom Menace at Leavesden Studios. 8. And when that movie hit theaters on May 19th, 1999, and the cultural backlash erupted, the adults in the room, the critics, the fans, the awards bodies, didn't aim their frustration at the billion-dollar studio apparatus or the filmmaker who'd made every creative decision. They aimed it at the kid. His classmates called him Mannequin Skywalker. That nickname didn't come from nowhere. Kids heard the adults talking, absorbed the contempt that critics and online commenters had normalized, and weaponized it the way kids do, directly, daily, to his face. His mother, Lisa Lloyd, later described the press tour alone as a kind of endurance test no child should face. Jake reportedly did as many as 60 media interviews in a single day during the promotional cycle. 60. Most grown actors find press tours exhausting. This was a 9-year-old being shuttled from camera to camera while the world was already sharpening its verdict. By around 2001, Jake Lloyd quit acting. He was 12. He reportedly destroyed his Star Wars memorabilia. Not sold it, not packed it away, destroyed it. Because the artifacts of what should have been the most magical experience of a young life had become unbearable to look at. The years after that brought nothing good. In June 2015, Lloyd was arrested in South Carolina following a high-speed car chase, and the reporting that followed revealed he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. His mother spoke to Scripps News in an exclusive March 2024 interview, offering a rare and painful glimpse into her son's long road through mental health treatment and time in a mental health facility. By January 2025, Jake himself had surfaced with a cautious public update, telling fans that everyone's been very supportive. A sentence that sounds simple until you remember why he needed support in the first place. He needed support because the world told a 10-year-old he was a joke. That's the foundation of this story. And if you think the institution responsible deserves a pass because it was just comedy, let's talk about the Razzies. The Golden Raspberry Awards were founded in 1981 by John Wilson, a Hollywood-adjacent publicist and copywriter, who conceived the ceremony as a satirical counterpoint to the Oscars. Harmless enough on paper. Poke fun at bad movies, generate some headlines, everyone has a laugh. Wilson still runs the organization today, alongside his partner Maureen Murphy. And over 4 decades, the Razzies have been treated by entertainment media as a legitimate, if irreverent, institution. Their nominations reported alongside Oscar picks, their winners announced with the same breathless coverage usually reserved for actual accomplishments. But here's what most people don't know about the Razzies, and it's the detail that collapses their entire premise of authority. Virtually anyone can vote. The Razzie voting body isn't composed of industry professionals. It's not accredited critics. It's not peers with any demonstrated expertise in filmmaking. It's anyone who pays the membership fee, historically around $40. That's it. That is the full barrier to entry. For the cost of a decent steak dinner, any person with an internet connection and an opinion becomes a Razzie voter. No credentials checked. No requirement to have actually watched the films being voted on in their entirety. No proof you've ever set foot on a film set, reviewed a movie professionally, or even finished film school. Nothing. This is the institution that nominated a 10-year-old for Worst Supporting Actor. This pay-to-vote mockery machine, not a professional body, not a critical institution, just a glorified internet poll with a ceremony attached, also nominated Jake Lloyd alongside Natalie Portman for Worst Screen Couple. A child and his adult co-star turned into a punchline about romantic chemistry. As if a prepubescent boy and a teenage actress were supposed to generate sparks while delivering dialogue they didn't write, in scenes they didn't conceive, on a set they didn't design. And the Razzies didn't stop with The Phantom Menace. They came back for Attack of the Clones in 2002, nominating Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman as Worst Screen Couple. They came back for Revenge of the Sith. Across all three prequels, they treated the films as an all-you-can-eat buffet of ridicule, and they were rewarded with exactly the media coverage they craved. Every nomination generated headlines. Every headline reinforced the narrative that these actors, these specific human beings, were failures. It took over 2 decades for any reckoning to arrive. In March 2022, the Razzies rescinded the award they'd given Bruce Willis after learning he'd been diagnosed with aphasia, a degenerative condition that had been affecting his performances in the exact films they'd mocked. That raised an uncomfortable question. If the Razzies were willing to take back an award when they discovered the circumstances were crueler than they'd assumed, what about the boy whose circumstances were cruel from the start and visible to anyone paying attention? Then, in January 2023, they nominated 12-year-old Ryan Kiera Armstrong for Firestarter, and this time the backlash actually stuck. Under significant public pressure, the Razzies announced they'd no longer nominate performers under 18, a rule change that implicitly admitted what should have been obvious in 2000. Children should not be publicly humiliated by institutions pretending to be comedy. No formal apology to Jake Lloyd was ever issued. They just quietly changed the rules and moved on, as if policy reform could retroactively undo the damage done to a child who grew up believing the world hated him for playing Anakin Skywalker. So that's the institutional villain. But institutions don't operate in a vacuum. They're amplified by culture, and the culture of the early 2000s internet was a hate amplification engine running at full throttle with zero accountability and no brakes. Think about what the internet looked like when the prequels came out. No social media as we know it. No algorithmic feeds. Just forums, chat rooms, early blogs. Sites like Ain't It Cool News, where the most extreme takes got the most traction, and the loudest voices set the tone for everyone else. Hating the prequels wasn't just an opinion in those spaces. It became a social bonding ritual, a cultural identity. You proved your sophistication, your real fan credentials, by articulating exactly how much you despised what George Lucas had done. The more cutting your take, the more attention you earned. The more you trashed the actors, the more replies you got. Agreement bred more agreement. Disagreement got you shouted down. And within a remarkably short window of time, 3, maybe 4 years, a consensus hardened into something that felt like objective truth. The prequels are bad. Everyone knows this. If you disagree, you're wrong. That's how bandwagon culture works. The most confident voice in the room sets the standard, and everyone else calibrates to it or gets marginalized. In fan communities, the dynamic is even more intense because fandom is identity. What you love and what you reject defines who you are in the group. Disagreeing with the consensus doesn't just mean having a different opinion. It means risking your membership in the community. So people fell in line. Some of them probably liked the prequels and never said so, because saying so wasn't worth the cost. Then came the long-form takedowns that turned casual disdain into something that looked like intellectual rigor. The red-letter media Mr. Plinkett reviews became a genuine cultural landmark in the late 2000s and early 2010s. These weren't 3-minute forum rants. They were multi-hour video deconstructions, 70 minutes or more per film, narrated in a deliberately creepy deadpan voice, picking apart every scene, every edit, every line reading, with the obsessive precision of a forensic investigation. And they were funny. Genuinely, undeniably funny in places. Which made them devastating, because they gave the hate train something it had never had before: intellectual respectability, a vocabulary, a framework. Suddenly, hating the prequels wasn't just venting into the void. It was participating in a form of media literacy. It was film criticism. Or at least it dressed itself up that way, convincingly enough to fool a generation of viewers who conflated cynicism with intelligence. The Plinkett reviews didn't just reflect the anti-prequel consensus. They calcified it. They gave a generation of internet-native fans a shared analytical language for why the prequels were failures. And in doing so, they made dissenting from that consensus feel like admitting you didn't understand cinema. If you loved the prequels after watching the Plinkett reviews, the implication was clear. You just didn't get it. You were the rube who couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else. And so the silence of the prequel defenders deepened. The kids who loved these movies kept it to themselves, waiting, though they didn't know it yet, for their numbers to become undeniable. But in the meantime, the actors paid the price. Not Lucas, who was too powerful and too remote to be truly hurt by internet commentary. Not the studio, which was too abstract to be a satisfying target. The actors, the faces on screen, the human beings whose names appeared in credits and whose bodies walked through the real world where fans could confront them, where journalists could ask them loaded questions, where every red carpet became an ambush. They were accessible, mockable, vulnerable. And the mob went after them with the enthusiasm of people who'd convinced themselves that cruelty was the same thing as taste. Which brings us to Ahmed Best. And this is where the story crosses a line it can never uncross. Ahmed Best was a trained performer, a dancer, actor, and physical comedian working with the Stomp Troupe, when George Lucas personally selected him to play Jar Jar Binks in The Phantom Menace. What almost nobody understood at the time, and what the hate train made it culturally impossible to appreciate, was that Best's work was genuinely pioneering. Jar Jar Binks was one of the first major motion capture characters in Hollywood history, a fully CGI creation whose movements, mannerisms, and emotional expressions were derived from Best's physical performance on set. This was years before Andy Serkis made Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, and the world decided motion capture was a legitimate art form worthy of awards consideration and breathless magazine profiles. Ahmed Best was doing it first, without a roadmap, without predecessors to study, inventing the craft as he went, performing in a bodysuit covered in tracking markers, on sets where he was the only person reacting to a character the audience would never see him inside of. None of that registered once the backlash hit. Jar Jar was despised, overwhelmingly, immediately, and with a particular toxicity, because the criticism was laced with accusations of racial caricature, accusations that the character embodied Caribbean and minstrel show stereotypes through his speech patterns, his physical comedy, his subservient role in the narrative. Scholarly work by researchers like Casey Allen at Mercer University would later analyze what Allen called the dialectic of fantasy displacement, the way audiences projected racial meaning onto the character and then redirected their discomfort onto the black performer behind it. Whatever the merits of that cultural conversation about the character, what happened to Ahmed Best the human being was something categorically different. He wasn't treated as an actor who'd taken a role. He became the role. Not the actor who played Jar Jar, but simply Jar Jar. A living punchline. A human avatar for everything people hated about the Phantom Menace. The distinction between character and performer collapsed entirely, and the hatred flowed through the gap like water through a broken dam. Online abuse, public ridicule, the kind of sustained, personal vitriol that treats another human being not as a person who made a creative choice, but as someone who committed an offense against your childhood and must be punished for it. In July 2018, Ahmed Best posted a photograph on Twitter. He was standing near the edge of a bridge with his young son, and he told the world that he had considered taking his own life in the aftermath of the Phantom Menace backlash. "I'm here to tell you that it does get better," he wrote, framing it as hope, but the confession underneath was devastating. A man was driven to the brink of suicide because fans didn't like the way a fictional alien talked in a children's space opera. That's not criticism. That's not fandom. That's not even hate. That's a mob with no understanding of the destruction it was causing and no interest in finding out. And now we arrive at the part that should have been the entire conversation from the beginning. The part the hate train never wanted to examine, because examining it would have required looking in the mirror instead of pointing fingers. It was never the actors. Say it again, because it's the thesis and it's provable. It was never the actors. The prequels had two specific, well-documented problems, and both of them had the same first and last name, George Lucas. His dialogue and his directing style. That's where the wooden performances came from, not from the talent on set. Start with the directing. Lucas's most common note to performers, dating all the way back to the original Star Wars in 1977, was the immortal phrase, "faster and more intense." That's it. That was the direction. Not, "in this moment, Padme is realizing she's losing Anakin to something she can't fight." Not, "play the subtext of a man who knows he's being seduced by power." Just faster, more intense. A direction so vague it borders on non-direction, a placeholder where actual guidance should be. Harrison Ford, during the original trilogy, reportedly told Lucas, "You can type this shit, but you sure can't say it." A line that perfectly captures the disconnect between Lucas as a visual world builder and Lucas as a director of human beings. And on the original trilogy, that weakness was partially masked. Actors performed on physical sets, opposite real co-stars, surrounded by tangible environments that gave them something to react against. The prequels stripped all of that away. Actors stood in vast, empty blue screen and green screen voids, cavernous sound stages with nothing in them but markers and tape on the floor, reacting to characters and landscapes that didn't exist yet, performing love scenes opposite tennis balls on sticks, channeling emotional devastation while staring at a blank wall that would later be replaced by a digital lava planet. Lucas himself conceded in interviews that working with actors was not his strong suit, that the intimate human dimension of filmmaking was simply not where his creative energy went. He said this, on record. The man behind the camera admitted the thing the actors were being crucified for was his limitation, not theirs. And then there's the dialogue. God, the dialogue. Read this line out loud. "I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. Not like here. Here everything is soft and smooth." That's from Attack of the Clones. Hayden Christensen delivers it to Natalie Portman during what is supposed to be a scene of romantic seduction. Tell me which actor on Earth makes that sound like something a real human being would say to another real human being in a moment of genuine attraction. Pick anyone. Daniel Day-Lewis, Cate Blanchett. It doesn't matter. That line lives in the screenplay, and the screenplay was written by George Lucas. Same story with Hold me like you did by the lake on Naboo, from Revenge of the Sith. A sentence that sounds like it was assembled by someone who'd read a description of romance in a foreign language phrasebook. Same with the notorious exchange. You're so beautiful. It's only because I'm so in love. No, it's because I'm so in love with you. Read that out loud to another person in a room. Watch their face. That's not a failure of performance. That's a failure of writing so fundamental that no performer could have rescued it. And then there's, "Are you an angel?" A line George Lucas wrote for an 8-year-old to deliver to a teenage queen with total sincerity. And then the culture blamed the 8-year-old when it didn't land. These aren't acting failures. They're writing failures, committed by a filmmaker who was brilliant at constructing myth and spectacle, but who should never have been left alone in a room with a love scene and a keyboard. And the proof is right there on every other set these actors ever walked onto. Natalie Portman. She was 12 years old when Luc Besson cast her as the lead in Leon the Professional in 1994. A performance of such startling, preternatural rawness that it announced a generational talent. By 1996, she was holding her own alongside Timothy Hutton in Beautiful Girls. She was already one of the most promising young actresses in Hollywood when Lucas cast her as Padme Amidala. And then the prequels came out, and the culture decided she couldn't act. Portman herself later acknowledged in interviews that she felt the prequels had damaged her professional reputation, that in their aftermath, people genuinely questioned whether she had talent. The Razzies had nominated her alongside child and adult co-stars. The internet had written her off as wooden. The consensus was settled. The answer arrived in 2010, when Darren Aronofsky directed her in Black Swan, a script worthy of her abilities, a director who understood how to excavate a performance from an actor's body and psyche. Natalie Portman won the Academy Award for Best Actress, the Oscar, the highest honor the profession bestows. The woman the internet had dismissed as lifeless stood on that stage and proved what should never have needed proving. The variable wasn't Natalie Portman. It never was. The variable was who was writing her lines and who was directing her delivery. Ewan McGregor tells a subtly different but equally damning version of the same story. He was already a star before the prequels. His electrifying Renton in Danny Boyle's 1996 Trainspotting had established him as one of the most charismatic actors in British cinema. He went from prequels to Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge in 2001 and was magnificent, brilliant in Tim Burton's Big Fish. He'd later deliver a quietly devastating dual performance in Season 3 of FX's Fargo in 2017. And here's the detail that should have ended this argument 2 decades ago. Even at the absolute peak of the hate train, almost nobody criticized McGregor's Obi-Wan. He was consistently cited as the one thing that worked. Prequel haters would say the acting was terrible, except Ewan McGregor, without ever stopping to wonder why, if the problem was acting talent, the man standing right next to everyone else on the same sets with the same scripts under the same direction was somehow immune. He wasn't immune. He was just so undeniably charismatic that he could bend Lucas's most sterile dialogue into something watchable through sheer force of personality. But the fact that the mob exempted him while condemning his co-stars reveals the whole game. They knew, on some level, it wasn't about talent. The cruelty was selective. And selective cruelty isn't criticism. It's something uglier. Hayden Christensen is the poster child for this entire injustice. Before Star Wars, he was one of Hollywood's most promising young talents. His performance in 2001's Life as a House earned him a Screen Actors Guild nomination and genuine critical acclaim. The industry noticed him. Awards bodies noticed him. He was on the trajectory that leads to leading man status and decade-spanning careers. Then he became Anakin Skywalker, and the hate train ran him over. Razzie nominations, endless mockery in every entertainment publication that wanted easy clicks. And Hollywood did what Hollywood does when the consensus turns against you. It stopped calling. The industry effectively froze him out of the kind of major roles his pre-Star Wars trajectory had promised. The man who'd earned a SAG nomination found himself on the outside, watching the door close not because he'd failed to perform, but because a cultural consensus had decided he was the problem. And in Hollywood, perception is career. So Hayden retreated to his farm in Ontario, stepped away from the industry, and largely disappeared from public life for years. Not because he'd lost his love of acting, but because the culture had made the cost of being visible too high. But here's the thing about the long game. It has a way of settling scores that the mob never sees coming. Because while Hayden Christensen was quietly living on that farm, and while the Razzies were collecting their $40 voting fees, and while the internet was congratulating itself for its sophisticated taste in cinema, something was shifting underneath all of it that nobody on the original hate train anticipated. The kids who watched the prequels in theaters were growing up. The 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 13-year-olds who didn't know they were supposed to hate these movies, who just thought the lightsaber fights were cool and the pod racing was exhilarating and Darth Maul was the scariest thing they'd ever seen. Those kids got older. They got online. And they didn't come quietly. The subreddit r/prequel memes exploded into one of the largest communities on the entire platform, millions of members strong, turning the very lines that had been mocked into the most quoted, most shared, most culturally omnipresent phrases in the entire Star Wars franchise. "It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. Hello there. Now this is pod racing. I am the Senate. Execute Order 66. A surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. This is where the fun begins." These weren't being quoted ironically anymore. Not really. Somewhere in the alchemy of meme culture, mockery had undergone a chemical transformation into genuine affection, and affection had hardened into devotion. The sand line? It's not an embarrassment anymore. It's a badge of honor. Try posting it in r/prequel memes and see if anyone treats it as a punchline. They won't. They'll upvote it into the stratosphere. The generational shift crystallized between roughly 2015 and 2020, when the kids who'd grown up on the prequels became the dominant voice in online fandom. And when the sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9, arrived and divided audiences in new and bitter ways, something happened that nobody in the original hate train predicted. People started looking back at the prequels and realizing that whatever their flaws, these films had something the sequels arguably lacked: a singular creative vision. One filmmaker's imagination, not a committee product. Ambitious world building. A complete, coherent, tragic arc. The fall of Anakin Skywalker. The corruption of the Republic. The rise of the Empire. Clumsy in places, sure. Dialogue that no human mouth should ever have been asked to shape into words, absolutely. But underneath all of that, a story that was trying to say something real about democracy, about fear, about how good people become monsters. It wasn't always gracefully executed, but it was built. And then there was Dave Filoni. His Clone Wars animated series, which ran for 7 seasons between 2008 and 2020, did something extraordinary. It took the characters the prequels had introduced and gave them the depth, the nuance, the emotional texture that Lucas's scripts hadn't managed to deliver. Anakin Skywalker, in Filoni's hands, became a fully realized human being. Funny, reckless, fiercely loyal, and heartbreakingly vulnerable in the moments that mattered most. His relationship with his Padawan, Ahsoka Tano, gave audiences the emotional stakes that the film's romantic storyline had struggled to establish. You watched Clone Wars Anakin, and you understood, in your gut, why his fall to the dark side was a tragedy and not just a plot point. Filoni didn't contradict the prequels. He completed them. He showed the world what was always there, buried underneath the stiff direction and the impossible dialogue, waiting for someone to excavate it. And in doing so, he gave a generation permission to take these films seriously, not as guilty pleasures, but as the foundation of something that genuinely mattered to them. The prequels weren't rehabilitated, despite the memes and the animated series and the generational shift. They were rehabilitated through them and beyond them. A full cultural reversal driven by millions of people who refused to accept the verdict their elders had handed down. And then Hayden came back. In 2022, he returned as Darth Vader in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series on Disney+. Not a cameo, not a quick fan service wink, a full, emotionally loaded performance that justified the entire show's existence. There's a scene, and if you've seen it, you already know exactly which one, where Obi-Wan damages Vader's helmet during a lightsaber duel, and the mask cracks open, and suddenly you're looking at Hayden Christensen's face through the shattered shell. One eye is Anakin. The voice shifts. Hayden's voice bleeding through the vocoder alongside James Earl Jones's bass rumble. And Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan says the name. Just the name. Anakin. And you can hear 20 years of grief in that single word. Vader responds, and it's both of them at once. The monster and the boy. Christensen played it with the kind of quiet, contained devastation that proves what should never have been in question. The man can act. He always could. In 2023, he appeared again in Ahsoka, stepping into the world between worlds, a mystical space outside of time where he appears to Ahsoka Tano as Anakin, her former master. Not the fallen version, not the monster, the man she remembered. Warm, present, alive with exactly the kind of energy and charisma that the prequel scripts had buried under impossible dialogue and blue-screen isolation. It was a scene that only worked because of everything Filoni's Clone Wars had built, and because Christensen brought a warmth and lightness to it that connected the animated character to the live-action one in a way that felt earned. And at Star Wars Celebration, when Hayden Christensen walked on stage, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. Not polite applause, not nostalgic acknowledgement. Thousands of people on their feet, some of them openly crying, for the man the Razzies had mocked, the man Hollywood had frozen out, the man who'd retreated to a farm because the culture told him he was the problem. He stood there and received the love that was 20 years overdue. Ahmed Best came back too. In 2020, he first returned to the Star Wars universe as Jedi Master Kelleran Beck in Star Wars Jedi Temple Challenge, a children's game show on the Star Wars YouTube channel. A quiet re-entry that proved Lucasfilm hadn't forgotten him. Then, in 2023, he appeared as the same character in Season 3 of The Mandalorian, rescuing young Grogu during the chaos of Order 66. A moment of pure, uncomplicated heroism for an actor who'd been treated as a villain for over 2 decades. The man who'd stood near a bridge and contemplated the end of his life walked back into the Star Wars universe not as a joke, not as a footnote, but as a Jedi who saves a child. And the fans who watched understood the weight of what they were seeing, even the ones who couldn't fully articulate it. The applause wasn't just for the character, it was an apology. Long overdue and nowhere near enough, but real. The prequels won the long game, not because the films are flawless. They aren't, and nobody serious is arguing they are. They won because the hate was never proportional, the cruelty was never justified, and the people who were targeted were never the ones responsible for the things that didn't work. The Razzies were a pay-to-vote joke that pointed its finger at a child. The internet mob was a self-reinforcing echo chamber that rewarded the most vicious takes with the most engagement, and called it criticism. The directing was minimal, and the dialogue was impossible. And the actors, every last one of them, proved, through careers that span Academy Awards and SAG nominations and critical acclaim across dozens of productions, that they were never the weak link. They were never the problem. The generation that grew up on these films now runs the cultural conversation. The meme lines aren't punchlines anymore. They're the most quoted dialogue in the entire franchise, more recognizable than anything from the originals to anyone under 35. Hayden came back to standing ovations. Ahmed came back as a Jedi. Natalie won an Oscar. Ewan never stopped being brilliant. And the haters didn't just lose the argument. They lost the future. That 10-year-old kid they nominated for Worst Actor? He deserved better. They all did. And the prequels? The prequels were never the problem. Subscribe for more stories like this.